If you weren't here with us last week, then I'll let you know that we've already covered the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. So even though I'm going to read that passage right now, we will not be covering it today. We covered it last week. One of the difficulties with this passage is that really verses 30 through 56 all go together. And for those of you who know me, I can't do that many verses in one Sunday unless I'm just racing and we take 2 hours. And so even though we won't be covering those verses, these really all go together. The feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, and then the disciples, them going to the Gennesaret, that all goes together. And so that makes for a difficult couple of weeks trying to divide that up and trying to have an outline. And so I won't have an outline for you this morning. It's going to be a little bit jarbled up, and so I hope that we can track and make it through clearly. So read with me, Mark 6. We're going to read verses 30 through the rest of the chapter. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those that ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Our text this morning begins in verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And when he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. As I mentioned before, those 3 stories all go together. Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, and the healings at Gennesaret. Now, even though we won't be covering that, you'll see that it leads up into our passage this morning, and it's very relevant. But allow me just to front load to you the 2 main points of our text this morning. The main point is about Jesus. The main point is about Jesus, the provider, the one who bends the material universe and who miraculously feeds impossible numbers of people and who walks on water and who can heal whoever he wants with the touch of the fringe of his garment. As I suggested to you last week, and I'll tell you again today, I believe this passage is subtly but profoundly teaching the deity of Christ. Only Jesus can bend the material universe. Only God can bend the material universe. And that is who Jesus is, as we see. There's a secondary point, and it's really about the disciples. In fact, we're going to see a contrast between the disciples and between this group of people at Gennesaret. You're going to see one group who doesn't recognize Jesus and another who does. You're going to see one group who doesn't understand, and they're struggling to believe in Jesus' power, and they're missing out on what Jesus has for them. And another group who fully recognizes him, who understands what his power can do, and who takes full advantage of the blessing that he offers. There is a contrast between these 2 groups. And really, the point of this passage is that faith is the channel that leads to blessing. If you would be blessed by Jesus, for the most part, this is a general rule, there are exceptions, you must have faith in him. If you would see him in his miraculous glory and understand him, you must trust him and believe in him. If you would be forgiven of your sins, you must believe that he's right about your need for forgiveness and his ability to forgive you. If you would be healed by him, if you would be blessed by him, you must trust that he can do it. Now, we hear that, and we have a knee-jerk reaction. We shudder, because that truth is abused very much so in our culture today, isn't it? And not just in our culture, but all throughout the globe. We hear people say, if you believe in Jesus, he will heal you. All of your opposition will go away. You will be blessed. You will be rich. You will be this or that. And that's very much an abuse of a kernel of biblical truth. Well, we will see that this passage flies in the face of believing in Jesus and not having any more opposition. But the reality is, Hebrews 11:6 tells us, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. And so we'll try and nuance out, instead of just giving this broad brush and saying, if you believe in him, all your problems will go away. That is not what the Bible teaches us. But if you would be blessed by him, if you would be forgiven, if you would know him, you must believe in him. And so the contrast is between the disciples who are following him and struggling to know him and believe in him, and an irony in a group that doesn't really know him, but they believe in him and they are blessed by him. And so as we go into this story of Jesus walking on the water, we really need to remind ourselves of where we were last week. And what I want you to pay attention to in this text is the time markers. There are a few markers of time in this passage. This is a very long day for the disciples and for Jesus. And so allow me to remind you of the timeline of where we've been last week. Verse 30, the apostles returned to Jesus after their missionary trip, and they report to him about all that they had done and taught. That probably took a little bit of time for them to get back and to report to him. Jesus tells the apostles in verse 31, it's time to go take a break. And in verses 32 through 33 or 34, they row to a desolate place. That probably took an hour or so, or more. Then they come ashore, and their plans get delayed. There's no rest for the disciples and for Jesus. He sees a crowd of vulnerable people, and he has compassion on them, and he takes some time to spend with them and to teach them. Guess what? That probably took an hour or two, at least. The disciples come to him in verses 35 and 36, and they say, it is getting late. Send them away. If they're to get dinner in the surrounding countryside, then they need to go now. It's getting late. Guess what? It's getting late. Verses 37 and 38, guess what? Jesus shifts gears, he changes their direction, and he says, no, we are going to feed these people. How many people? Well, verse 44 tells us 5,000 men, but Matthew clarifies in Matthew 14:21 that that's 5,000 men besides the women and the children. This crowd could have easily been 10, 15, 20, 25,000 people. How long do you think it takes to feed that many people? Probably quite some time. Not only that, they pick up afterwards. They take up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Do you want to know what the point of all this is, of this recap? It's been a long day. It has been a long day for the disciples and for Jesus. And guess what? It is not over. Start with me in verse 45. It says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, we're thinking, okay, we just fed this crowd. Now it's time for us to get some rest. No, it's still not. Jesus says, you guys need to go right now. Notice it says, immediately he made them get into the boat. There's another abrupt change. Why would there be this strange and abrupt change? And why would Jesus go from wanting to get rest to making them go back to Bethsaida while he dismisses the crowd? It seems kind of abrupt and strange, doesn't it? Well, it's consistent with the detail that John gives us in John's telling of this story. In John 6:15, John tells us that the crowd was pretty impressed by the fact that Jesus could feed so many people miraculously. And they thought, you know what, this guy would make a good king. Imagine what he would do to our poverty. Imagine what he would do to our economy and our welfare system if we had a king who could just feed all of us miraculously with no effort. And so John says they decide, we're going to make this guy king by force. And that's when Jesus says, no, that's not what's going on. Disciples, you need to go. I'll take care of these people. And so instead of getting rest, There's more work for both of them. Jesus has to dismiss this gigantic crowd, and the disciples are away rowing. And keep that in mind. The disciples are already rowing in verse 46 or verse 45. Verse 46 continues. It says that after he had taken leave of the people, he goes up on the mountain to pray. Notice this. You might think that's restful, but consider this. Jesus goes up a mountain to pray. He takes time to dismiss all these people, and then he goes on a short hike to a desolate place by himself to pray. So he rejects rest, he chooses more work, and he goes to pray. That's how much prayer was a priority to Jesus. That even though he's exhausted, he will expend more effort and take more time so that he can be by himself, away from people, and pray. Let me ask you this. When is the last time that you exerted effort to pray? When is the last time that you got away from people to pray? When's the last time you left the house, or left town, or went on a hike just to be with your Father? I'll admit it's been a long time for me, and maybe we would all do well to do that. That's just a key for us, a little detail for us to glean from there. And so you'll remember maybe that in chapter 1, Jesus got away from people to pray, and I recommended a book to you there. I'm going to recommend it again. It's one of my favorite books. It's called A Praying Life by Paul Miller. It's the best book on prayer that I've ever read. Continuing in verse 47, it says, when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. This is one of our time markers. This is one of our key details in the text. Notice it says, when evening came. You see, when the disciples said, it's getting late, that's kind of subjective. For Callie and I, our bedtime's at 8 o'clock. That's late. Just kidding. But when they say it's getting late, that's subjective. That could mean a couple of different things. And even though I've given you this timeline and I've said, I've inferred, it probably took this much time, I've not actually told you how long anything took because we don't have any markers yet. Now, we have our first marker. Evening has come. When was evening in this culture and in this language? Well, it's sunset. And if you'll notice in verse 39, there's green grass. That might not seem significant, but there is a short window of time in Israel when there's green grass, and that is spring. And sunset is 6 or 7 p.m. And so let's say right now evening is 7 p.m., okay? When evening came, when it's 7 p.m., the boat is out on the sea, and Jesus is alone on the land. 7 p.m., they've already been rowing for who knows how long. Okay? Keep that in your pocket. Verse 48 says that he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them, and about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea, and he meant to pass by them. Before we get to the miracle, before we get to Jesus walking on the water, I want you to notice something. I'm going to front load this to you, and then we're going to develop it and chew on it, and then we're going to come back and apply it. I want you to notice in the big picture that Jesus allows his disciples to suffer here. This is a very important detail. Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully, and he allowed it to happen. Okay? Let's develop that. First of all, I want you to notice that he saw them. It's evening. They've been rowing for who knows how long, and Jesus can still see them from the hilltop. But guess what that means? They haven't made it very far. In fact, when John tells us this story, he says that the distance that they made it, the whole time that they were rowing, by the time Jesus came to them, they made it 3 or 4 miles. John 6:19 tells us. Now that might not strike you as odd, but just so you know, 3 or 4 miles is what an average rowboat can do in an hour. And it's been a certain amount of time. We're going to see that it's 8 hours at least that they've been rowing, and they only make it 3 or 4 hours. So Jesus sees them. They haven't made it very far. Why? Here we have some burly, motley fishermen who are used to rowing. They should have no problems with this. Why haven't they made it very far at all? Well, you'll notice it says that the wind was against them. The wind was against them. Not only that, but it says he saw that they were making headway painfully. Let me paraphrase that for you. Let me give you a more word-for-word translation there. It says that he saw that they were tormented in their rowing. Jesus saw them being tormented in their rowing. This is the same word that's used in Mark 5 when Jesus cast out the legion of demons. They say, I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Same word here. Jesus saw that they were tormented by their rowing because the wind was against them. That's an interesting note. If you remember the last time that they were on the sea and they had a problem with the wind, They learned something, didn't they? They learned something about who controls the wind. Jesus calms the storm, and the disciples, they say, "Who then is this, that the wind and the sea obey him?" So Jesus sees them. They're still within eyesight. They're being tormented in their rowing because the wind is against them, and Jesus is in control of the wind. In other words, Jesus is allowing them to be tormented. Jesus is allowing them to suffer. He's watching it happen. I'll tell you what, if I was one of the disciples right now, I would be so annoyed and frustrated with Jesus. From the very first time he said, "So how are we going to feed these people?" He asks Philip in John chapter 6, "So how are we going to feed these people?" I'd say, "I don't know, Jesus. We're supposed to be getting rest. What do you mean, how are we going to feed these people?" Not only that, then we have to feed these people after he told us that we were going to get rest. And granted, that was pretty cool that we did that, but now he sends us away. We're not getting the rest that he told us we were going to get, and now we're rowing into the wind. Alistair Begg pointed out the last time he was with us in a storm, he was asleep. Now he's not even with us. I sure could use some of that wind-controlling power right now, Jesus. Thanks for not coming with us. I would have been so frustrated. How long is this going to go on? Well, as we keep reading, you'll notice in verse 48, it says that at the fourth watch of the night. About the fourth watch of the night. Do you know what time the fourth watch of the night was? It was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So let's call it 3 a.m. Here's our other concrete time marker. Jesus comes to them on the sea at 3 a.m. They started, or they were already rowing at 7 p.m., and he doesn't come to them. He watches them suffer until 3 a.m. Now forgive me, I'm going to be really repetitive here. I'm going to hammer this nail in because it's really important for how we deal with suffering. Jesus allowed his disciples to row into the wind that he could have stopped for at least 8 hours. I want you to hold on to this. We're going to come back and we're going to apply it. Jesus allows his disciples to be tormented by situations that he could take away with the snap of his fingers. The next time, if you're not suffering right now, the next time you go into suffering, if you hold on to that thought, it will change the way that you handle your suffering. Now we reach the turning point. Verse 48 continues. It says that he came to them walking on the sea. Why did Jesus allow this to go on for so long? Why did he allow these guys to suffer and to be tormented? Well, my guess is he probably had a different reason for each one of them. But part of the reason that he had for them is so that he could come to them in an amazing way that they never would have expected. In a wonderful, miraculous show of his deity, he would come to them walking on the sea. Had he not sent them into all of this, they wouldn't have had this dramatic picture and this dramatic story to tell. And so he had a wonderful reason, plus probably more that we don't even know about. As we continue, there's this really interesting note in verse 48 that says he meant to pass by them. It can also be translated, he wanted to pass by them. What do we do with that? Why would he not just come to them? Or is that what it means when it says he comes to them walking on the sea? Well, there are different options for how people understand this. Alistair Begg said that this was probably just the perspective of the disciples. We believe Peter is the one behind this, giving this to Mark, and so it might have appeared to the disciples like he meant to pass by them, but actually he was coming to them. Other people interpret this passage by saying, sometimes Jesus comes by us so that we can ask him to come to us. And there's another example of that in Luke's gospel, in the road to Emmaus. Luke 24, it says that they drew near to the village to which they were going. Jesus is walking with two disciples. And it says that he acted as if he were going to go farther, but they urged him to stay. So in that case, Jesus is pretending or acting like he's going to go on because he wants them to choose themselves and to say, Jesus, come with us. I think that's a valid way to understand this passage. But there's another suggestion that goes quite a bit deeper, and I think it's very interesting. Some people think that when it says Jesus meant to pass by them, that it's trying to echo an idea from the Old Testament. Let me ask you this. Can you think of any episodes in the Old Testament when somebody passed by somebody else? There's a couple of them. There's a handful of them. The most famous one would be Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses said, Lord, show me your glory. And he says, you can't see my glory. But the eventuality of the passage, it says that the Lord passed by Moses as he was on Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. There's a very similar story in 1 Kings 19, where Elijah is on the same mountain, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and it says that the Lord passed by Elijah. There's a really interesting passage in Job 9, and I paraphrased it and abridged it for you, so this is going to sound a little bit more similar than it should. But Job is talking about God and saying how he can't understand God's works, and he says, "He tramples on the waves of the sea. He passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him." If you're interested, that's Job chapter 9, verses 8 through 11. You don't have to turn there, but if you want to write that down for later on. But Job is talking about how he can't understand God's works and that God passes by him on the sea and he doesn't even know. Granted, that's a bridge, that's paraphrased. I kind of tailored it to make it sound like this. But all that to say, using those three passages, people have said when Jesus means to pass by them, what it means is that Jesus is meaning to manifest his deity to them. Jesus wants them to see that he is the God who bends the material universe, that he is the God that fed the 5,000 and that can walk on the water, that's not bound by the laws of our universe. Is it certain? Well, I don't think it's certain, but I think it's a really interesting thought. I think that all of those are valid ways to understand this. But let's continue. Let's see what the response of the disciples is. Verses 49 through 52 continue. It says, "When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.' And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." I want you to make three observations about their response and about what happens. First of all, the disciples are afraid because they don't recognize him. Why don't they recognize him? Because their hearts were hardened. So they don't recognize him because their hearts were hardened. In the bigger picture, the disciples missed out on what Jesus was trying to do because they had hard hearts. When we have hard hearts, which we'll come back to, we miss out on what Jesus has for us. I want you to notice first that they're afraid. They think that it's a ghost. You see, had they understood, verse 52 says they don't understand because their hearts were hardened. Had they understood, they shouldn't have batted an eye at what was going on. William Hendrickson says, if they had fully understood the significance of the miraculous feeding, they would have known that it implied Christ's power to bend the material universe. That shouldn't have surprised them at all. Well, he just did that crazy stuff that he did with the loaves and the fish. Of course he can walk on water. They wouldn't have been surprised. Maybe they would have been surprised, but not afraid, for certain. Now, notice also how Jesus quenches their fears. Jesus says, I understand you guys are afraid. Take heart. It's me. It's Jesus. You don't have to be afraid. I'm here. That's an echo of what we heard all throughout chapters 4 and 5. We don't have to fear when we know Jesus. In other words, in this passage, Jesus is the cure to our fears, or at least he should be. Many times as Christians, and I'll tell you this, I have been confronted with my fear more this year than I ever have before. And it's because of this study in Mark. Christians have no reason to be afraid, and yet so many times we are. But I promise you that if you understood the one to whom you belong, you would have no reason to fear. You don't. Jesus is the cure to our fears. When you're suffering, when you feel like a ship in the night, when you're scared, hear him saying, take heart. I'm with you. He's promised that he'll always be with us, and you don't have to be afraid because of that. Look at verse 52. It tells us why they were afraid. It says they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. That's a really interesting note. Mark there connects the stories of him walking on water with him feeding the 5,000. He says, had they understood what he was trying to communicate with the feeding of the 5,000, they would have understood this. But they didn't get this. They were afraid because they didn't understand about the loaves, because, and this is a key detail, because their hearts were hardened. Let's camp there for a second. Let's camp on what it means to have a hard heart, because you know what? When I think about people having a hard heart, do you know what I think of? I think of people as being hostile towards Jesus. And that's true, isn't it? Some people who have hard hearts are hostile towards Jesus. We saw that in chapter 3. It's when Jesus healed the man with the withered hand. It says that he was grieved at their hardness of heart. And they were hostile towards him. Right after that, they went out and counseled how they were going to kill him. And so sometimes having a hard heart means you're hostile. But do you know what this passage tells us? It tells us that if you have a hard heart, it doesn't necessarily mean you're hostile. In fact, this passage tells us that disciples of Jesus, those who know him the best, those who have been around him, they can have hard hearts. I wonder how many of us have hard hearts. I wonder how many of us don't understand the fullness of his power. We don't believe that the things that he did in the Gospels, or the power that he exhibited in creating and sustaining the universe, we don't think that applies to us. We don't think that he can protect us, or grow us, or do things in and with us with his power. I'll tell you what, I struggle with a hard heart. If I really believe every word of the Gospels as I profess to, if I really believe them, I wouldn't go through life with the fear that I have. But I struggle with a hard heart. And I'm sure that many of us do. Let's continue on. Now, as we move through verses 53 through 56, we're going to see the contrast. This passage, this little paragraph, it summarizes a section of Jesus' ministry for us. And if we're not careful, we'll miss out the fact that it's connected to the previous paragraphs. But as we read it, let's look for the contrasts. Verses 53 through 56 say this. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. Again, this is a contrast. This is the exact opposite of what we've just seen through the disciples. First of all, you'll notice when they get out of the boat, the people immediately recognize Jesus. The disciples didn't recognize Jesus, but the people of Gennesaret do. If there was anybody walking on the water, the disciples should have thought, that must be Jesus. No, they think it's a ghost. So they don't recognize him, but the people of Gennesaret do. Next, I want you to notice what's the response of the people from Gennesaret. What do they do when they recognize him? Well, it says that they go get sick people on their beds, and they bring those people to Jesus and say, can we touch the fringe of your garment? Now, if you've been with us in Mark, or if you're familiar with Mark, those should sound familiar to you. Those should sound like echoes of things that have already happened in Mark. Jesus in chapter 2 healed a man who was lame and couldn't get up. He was on his bed. His friends brought him on his bed. And then in chapter 5, Jesus healed a woman without even knowing. All she did was come and touch the fringe of his garment. Do you know what it seems like? It seems like the people in Gennesaret have heard those stories. They've heard that Jesus can heal lame people who can't get out of bed. They heard about the friends who took their friend on his bed to go be healed by Jesus. And they said, well, we're going to go do that. They've heard that a woman was healed by the fringe of Jesus' garment. And they said, well, then we're just going to ask that we can touch the fringe of his garment. Do you see they're doing the exact opposite of what the disciples did? They've heard about something, and they say, we heard about what Jesus did, and we believe he can do it again. Contrast that with the disciples, who didn't just hear about the things Jesus has done. They've seen it face to face. They've seen it right in front of their faces what Jesus had done. In fact, you can even think of Peter and James and John, who Jesus said, come with me and see me raise this girl from the dead. How he's going to say, come with me and watch me be transfigured. Come with me and pray with me in the garden before my death. Peter and James and John have seen things closer than anybody else have, and yet they don't recognize Jesus walking on the water. But the people of Gennesaret have just heard of this stuff. And they say, we believe that that can happen again. And so there's a contrast between what happens. And this is where we come back to the point of this passage. What's Mark trying to show us with this contrast? He's trying to show us, again, that faith is the key to participating in the kingdom. Faith is the key to being blessed by Jesus. There are exceptions to that rule. We think of Legion. There's no story about the man being possessed by Legion having faith in Jesus, and yet Jesus saves him anyway. There are exceptions to that rule, so don't think there's this one-to-one correlation or correspondence, because that's what the people do that abuse this. If you believe, then therefore this will happen. That's not what I'm telling you. What I am telling you is this passage tells us, generally speaking, if you would be blessed by him, you must believe in him. You must trust in him. If you would be blessed by his miraculous power, you must believe that he has it. If you would be forgiven of your sins, you must believe that that you're a sinner and that he can forgive your sins. Again, Hebrews 6 tells us if you would please him, you must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. More specifically, this passage tells us something about faith in the midst of trials. I want you to consider again how Jesus put the disciples through the ringer. This passage exhorts us to believe in Jesus and anticipate him and expect him and look for him even when he puts us through the ringer. Think about the day the disciples had yesterday. Let's get some rest. Never mind, I'm going to teach these people. Never mind, we're going to feed these people. Never mind, you're going to go back to Bethsaida into a wind that I could control, but I'm not going to stop. Why doesn't Jesus stop the wind? Why does he put us through the ringer? Is he putting you through the ringer right now? Do you feel like a ship in the night? Let me ask you this. Have you had this thought? God is completely sovereign over my circumstances. God could deliver me from this with the snap of his fingers, and yet he doesn't. Why doesn't he do that? Why doesn't he just fix our problems? Why doesn't he just snap our fingers and let our problems go away? Let me get specific, because when I say that this applies to us, I don't mean that this applies to Christians in general, but it does. I mean this applies to Middleton Baptist Church. This applies to some of the situations that are going on in our lives. We have people who've recently had family members pass away, and they're struggling with mourning and grief. We have people whose family members are passing away, and they might be thinking, Jesus, why don't you just take away my emotions? Why don't you just help me to be happy and joyful again? Think about some of the kids that have died in the Treasure Valley in the last couple of weeks. Their families might be thinking, God, if you're in control of this stuff, why did you let that happen? You're sovereign. Why wouldn't you protect my kid? Maybe you have unbelieving family and friends, and you're struggling with the fact that God is not saving them, and you say, God, I can't change their heart. Only you can. You could change their heart without any effort. Why don't you do that? You could do it with a snap of your fingers. Some of us here are dealing with sickness and injury, and God could take away our pain and our sickness like that, and he doesn't. And we think, God, why don't you do that? Why don't you just fix our lives? Why don't you just make everything better? Maybe you're facing opposition at work or in school or somewhere else, and you think, God could just take this away. He's not intimidated by my enemies. This doesn't have to be, and yet God is allowing me to go through it. Maybe you're struggling in your family. Maybe it's not an unbelieving family member. Maybe it's a family member who is a Christian, and you're struggling with communication or frustration or fighting. Or maybe one of your kids is frustrating the snot out of you. And you think, God, you could change my kid so easily. You could change my spouse or me so easily. And yet you don't. Why don't you? You're rowing into the wind, aren't you? He controls the wind in your life. He could take it away. He has at times before. He might someday in the future, but right now, he's not. You're rowing into the wind. Can I exhort you with this? If you're rowing into the wind, trust in him. Believe in him. Know that he has a good reason for not taking the wind away. He has a good reason for not taking your emotions away, for taking your opposition or your frustration or your fighting away. He has a reason. He had a reason for the disciples. I'm not telling you that he's going to come to you walking on the water. I'm not telling you that you're going to see a miracle. What I'm telling you is if you don't believe in him, if you don't trust in him, if you have a hard heart, you may very well miss out on what he has for you in this season. He has something. But you need to trust him and look for him in the midst of the storm. You need to know, yeah, he controls the wind. Yeah, he controls that situation. I don't know why I'm here, but you've just got to keep rowing. You know, it's really to the credit of the disciples that they rowed for as long as they did. I have no idea why they did. They could have just said, you know what, we'll meet them tomorrow. We're just going to go to the coast. We're just going to go on shore right now. We'll get some rest. We'll meet them tomorrow. They didn't do that. Can I exhort you to keep rowing? Keep moving forward in whatever your situation is, and trust in him and look for him. What does it look like when we trust him and look for him in the midst of these situations? First of all, I think we keep our eyes open and we look for him. We seek him. It's dark, it's windy, there's waves, but we look. Think about the things that he's done in the past. Think about the Bible and all the amazing works that he's done there, and believe. The God who parts the Red Sea, the God who walks on the water, the God who raises little girls from the dead by just saying, honey, get up. He can do whatever he wants in your life, and he knows what's best. Maybe you can think about some of the amazing things that God has done in your life. Maybe you have seen a miracle. Maybe you have seen an amazing bit of providence that you just know that it was God. Think about those times. Remember what God has done in the past and know that he could do it again in the future whenever he wants. I remember one time I was going through a really frustrating season, and I'd only been a believer for a year or so. And I was praying, God, show me that you're close to me. Show me that you're close to me. And I just kept repeating that and repeating that and repeating that. And I don't know why I was praying that. I was just really upset, and I wanted to know that God was with me. And that night I went to church and we read Psalm 34. And Psalm 34:18 says, the Lord is close to those who are brokenhearted. And it was like, I know that was God providentially bringing me to that passage to answer my prayer. Many of you have those same stories. Think of what he has done in the past and know that as you row into the wind, he can do the same thing in the future, and that he's got a good reason for waiting. When we trust in him in the midst of our seasons, when we trust in him in the midst of our struggling and our rowing, instead of complaining about our circumstances, we complain to God about our circumstances. We don't just tell our friends about it, we tell God about it. Our prayer lives should reflect our anticipation of his coming. Instead of telling your friends, tell God, I'm really not a fan of what you're doing in my life right now. I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. And it's better to tell him that than to tell your friends that. When we seek him in the midst of our suffering, we're able to repent of our anxiety and our fear and our frustration and our impatience. If you're convinced that he's doing that, your fear and all that stuff will go away. It will. Because you trust in him, because you know that he's going to do something. You know, I tell you that if I was one of the disciples rowing in the boat, that I would have been frustrated and annoyed. And many of you would have too. You know what? When we're in the midst of circumstances that we wouldn't prefer, when we complain, when we're frustrated, when we're impatient, when we have fear, when we have anxiety, guess what? We are frustrated disciples rowing and complaining. And I am the first of you that's guilty of that, of being frustrated with my situation and saying, God, why don't you just take it away? Know that when you trust in him and when you wait for him, that kind of stuff goes away, or it should. It might not be very easy, but it can. Let me remind you of this. Whatever your situation is, and if you're not there now, if you're not rowing into the wind now, I promise you that you will be at some point. When you're rowing into the wind, you're not alone. What do I mean by that? Do I mean that other Christians are rowing with us? Well, certainly I mean that. The situations that I just named are many of us. And the disciples got through that rowing because they were together. There's no way that one of them by himself could have rowed for 8 hours straight. So they were with each other. They had to help each other and switch and support each other and serve each other and encourage each other. And we should be doing that same thing. We should be marking the people in our church who are rowing into the wind, who feel like they're alone, who are struggling. And we should go to them and support them even when we're in pain and say, I'm with you. I'm rowing into the wind too. I get it. But when I say that you're rowing into the wind and that you're not alone, there's somebody else who had to row into the wind. You see, sometimes when we're in the midst of these situations, we look to Jesus and we say, who are you to make me go through this? You don't understand. You're God. You don't have weakness or problems. If there's anybody who knows about unnecessary or irrelevant trials, it's Jesus. Turn with me to Mark 14. Mark 14, starting in 32, this is the night before his death. This is the night of his arrest. They went to a place called Gethsemane, Mark 14, 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here with me and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, that the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but you will. Do you know who knows about unnecessary stuff? Jesus. It wasn't necessary for him to go to the cross. He didn't have to, and he did. And he's exhibiting the same anxiety that we exhibit. Not sinful anxiety, but he's saying, you'll notice he says, Father, all things are possible for you. He knows that God could change his circumstances with the snap of his fingers. God, all things are possible for you. And he pleads, take this away from me. I don't want to suffer under your wrath. I don't want to go through this. Of course he did, but he didn't at the same time. And he says, yet, not what I will, what you will be done. Not what I want, but what you want. When we row into the wind, we're not alone. Jesus rode into the wind. For 33 years. He didn't have to go through any of that, and yet he did for us. So as you row into the wind, as you go through this season, or the next time you go through this season, let me exhort you to just pray like this, something like this. Lord, take this storm away. All things are possible for you. All things are possible for you, and you control the wind that is opposing me right now. And if you wanted, you could take it away. Please take it away. Yet, not what I will, what you will. And in the meantime, give me the eyes to look for you in the midst of the storm. Take my hard heart away. Help me to believe in you and to anticipate in you and to look for you in the midst of this. And in the meantime, help me to row faithfully. You're watching me be tormented by my rowing. You see everything that's going on. Take it away. But if you won't take it away, give me the faith to look for you and to row into the wind. Amen? Let's pray that.